This video is somewhat of a continuation of my power ranking series. In the past, I made 3 separate videos on ranking the top 10 characters in the series, but with a twist. I ranked the top 10 characters in every arc based on what we knew at that time in the series. For example, I didn't rank someone like Kakuzu or Hidan until part 2, because we had no idea who they were before them. Another example would be that when I ranked Jiraiya in part 1, I didn't consider something like Sage Mode since that wasn't even mentioned until his fight against Pain. So really, it was a video looking back into our perspectives when we first watched the series, and I also did things like talk about who had the strongest defense or water-style jutsu in every arc. This video is a little different though. I'll be eventually hitting all those arcs again in this video, but I'm not going to be restricting the information I have this time. Instead, I'll be ranking the top Shinobi alive of each era. So for example, Minato made my list in almost every arc in the original Power Rankings videos, but this time he won't be eligible for any of the eras before his birth or after his death. So I'll not only be doing rankings for each era, but also talk about the dynamics of power across the world in each era too. Examples of this would be who is the fastest of each era, and how each era stacks up against each other power-wise. I will preface this, like I did with the original Power Rankings videos, by saying that there will be a lot of gray areas in these rankings due to a lack of information. We don't exactly know how strong Prime Hiruzen or the young Sannin were in the Second Shinobi War, for example. The other thing I'll say before starting this ranking is that even if a character dies in an era, I will still rank them in that era. There will be some other rules I'll note that are specific to an arc, but I'll wait to mention them for their respective arcs. The last thing I want to say is that this video is very focused on who is the strongest in the known Shinobi world, so reputation is going to play a big part of my rankings. This is just another way I want to switch up my power rankings and stay true to the spirit of this video. For characters who I view to be in the same tier power-wise, I'm going to favor the ones with the higher worldwide reputation. When I was making these rankings, it just seemed right to do that based on this being focused on the known Shinobi world in each era. So while I do often rank lesser known characters higher than the more prominent ones, it will be the other way around this time. That's everything I wanted to say for the introduction, so I'll go ahead and start with the first era of Shinobi. I've chosen not to start at the beginning with Kaguya's time because that is just so detached from the rest of Shinobi history it doesn't feel relevant. There's also only about 6 possible people I could rank at that time, and it's pretty cut and dry on where they go anyway. So I wanted to start with the Warring States period since that's when Shinobi history really starts. It's uncertain when this period actually began, but we know that it concludes with the Uchiha and Senju uniting to create the Leaf Village, and this inspires the rest of the world to follow suit and create their own villages. It's almost like a dawn of civilization story. So I'll be making the end of this period the first Kage summit, since that is when we know for certain that the rest of the world was civilized by them. Most likely the first Great Shinobi War was right after this as well, so that's a good stopping point. I'll go ahead and mention the special rule for this arc since this one's pretty severe. Because we don't know anything at all about the other 4 first Kage and 3 of the second Kage, I'm not going to be officially ranking them for this era. I will say that they are in the top tier of their village, but they just aren't notable enough for me to talk about. Even Kabuto didn't feel the need to reanimate them, and he reanimated people like Asuma and the 7 Ninja Swordsmen who were just jonin. It's not even necessarily a matter of too much time passing to find their corpse, because people like Mu, Hashirama, and Tobirama were all reanimated, and they did not live that long past the summit. I'd rather just focus on the characters that we know for sure for these rankings, because these other Kage have no feats and don't seem that impressive anyway. Because of that rule, I won't be able to do a top 10 for this arc, but I'll go ahead and start with number 6 anyway. At 6 I have Onoki, and at 5 I have Mu. Mu was present at the first Kage summit as the first Tsuchikage's bodyguard, and we know he was the second Tsuchikage as well. So he should still be one of the strongest around at this time. Onoki actually was also active during this era, as he did fight Madara alongside Mu. This says a lot about the two, considering that they were the ones who fought an encroaching Madara instead of their Tsuchikage. How strong Onoki was at this time is uncertain, since we don't see any bits of actual fighting when we see flashbacks of this encounter. Madara did recognize Onoki in the war at first because of his ability to fly, so he and Mu must have had that ability at least by then. Madara also never showed any kind of surprise reaction when he saw particle style in the war, so it's very likely Onoki had already mastered it in this era as well. I give the edge to Mu for this ranking because Onoki is still a teenager at the end of this era. Next to number 4 I have Izuna, and at number 3 I have Tobirama. These two were lifelong rivals, with Tobirama eventually getting the better of Izuna towards the end of the Warring States period. Out of everyone who made the official list, Hidan is the one we know the least about, but considering that he was the rival to the second strongest of the Senju suggests he deserves a spot. He also possessed the Mangekyo Sharingan, but we don't know exactly what he could do with it. After his death, the Uchiha had one more major fight with the Senju, and then immediately after that the Leaf Village was created. So I still give him the edge over Mu and Onoki because those two have weaker feats for this time period specifically. Neither Mu or Onoki had likely hit their prime yet in this era, since Onoki was not fully grown and Mu was not named the first Uchikage. As for Tobirama, he clearly deserves the number 1 spot for the non-gods of Shinobi in this era. He's much more proven than Mu and Onoki at this point, and he was able to defeat Izuna. While we do know that he has Flying Rising at this point, he likely also has Edo Tensei too. After Madara dropped a meteor on the Shinobi Alliance, he noticed the Edo Tensei was designed to take people down with you, so this suggests that Tobirama was using this before Madara faked his own death. Of course, Madara is second and Hashirama is first, but that doesn't need any type of explanation. So the ranking's now over, let's talk about the dynamics of this era. It starts when Hashirama, Madara, Izuna, and Tobirama were still children, and far away from being the strongest of their clans. Once they reached adulthood, they became the leaders of their clans, along with the other Kage and future Kage likely being in similar situations in other isolated pockets of the world. The death of Izuna marked the beginning of the end for this period, as swarms of Uchiha began to surrender themselves to the Senju. After Madara was defeated by Hashirama, both clans allied with each other to create the first hidden village. Other prominent clans, like the Sarutobi clan, joined, and soon after, other hidden villages were also created. More than likely, the Leaf got many of the prominent clans from the Warring States period, since they were the first great nation, and they had the 2 strongest clans in the world at that time. This could give us an in-universe explanation for why the Leaf had so much talent compared to the other great nations, all the way up to the 4th Great Shinobi War. Due to the power struggles in creating a nation, Madara went rogue though. He specifically went to other lands like the Land of Stone to tell them to bow down to the Leaf Village. With the future of the Shinobi world on the line, Hashirama was able to defeat Madara, thus securing the village system we see all the way up to the present day. Although Madara was able to Izanagi away his death, he was dead for all intents and purposes, considering that he went into hiding after this fight. With the threat of Madara gone, the Leaf was now by far the strongest village in the world at this time. Not only did they have Hashirama, but they also had every tailed beast, excluding the one-tails in their possession by the first Kage summit. Hashirama and Tobirama distributed away the tailed beast as a way to balance out international power for the sake of peace. This was noted to have ended small-scale conflicts associated with the Warring States period, thus ushering in a new era. However, the Leaf soon lost their undisputed top dog status with the distribution of the tailed beast and the mysterious death of Hashirama. This power vacuum that was left by his death may have even been the start of the First Great Shinobi War. But as for titles boasted during this era, there aren't that many because we know so little about it. We know Tobirama was the fastest because Madara said so himself in the war arc, and we can presume that he was also the best at water style too. Madara would have had the strongest dojutsu and fire style and probably genjutsu. Hashirama would have had the strongest variant of earth style. The Leaf had the title of the strongest village by far during this time, with the stone probably being second. Too little is known about the other villages to rank them. Overall, the top power levels seen during this time would not be seen again for around 100 years when the 4th Great Shinobi War happened. On average, this era is probably much weaker than any of the following eras. There are a few reasons I believe this. When Kakuzu was defeated by Naruto, Kakashi explains to him that every generation surpasses the last, and this is something that makes sense logically. While people like Kakashi and Minato had to invent Chidori and Rasengan, people like Naruto and Sasuke could learn it from them without needing years of effort to invent it. Knowledge has been shown to trickle down to Naruto, and even the concept of survival of the fittest could explain why each generation surpasses the last one. Other bits of in-universe evidence that supports this idea is the fact that only a select few were reanimated from the Warring States period. We also see that Shinobi wore much bulkier armor during this time, suggesting that fighting was far more limited to close quarters combat and not ninjutsu. By the second Shinobi War, we see the Sannin wearing much less bulkier armor compared to the Warring States period, and by the 4th Great Shinobi War, we see very light pieces of armor such as chainmail and the Jonin jackets. By then, fighting had become much more ninjutsu based, which is likely because the average shinobi had gotten so much stronger since the Warring States period. The one advantage I will give to this era, though, is that they are by far the most experienced, which does give them a considerable edge over many of the people alive during the Fourth Great Shinobi War. I think I've said everything I wanted to say for this era, so I'll go ahead and go on to the next one. The era of the First Great Shinobi War is one where every village had at least one Kage die, suggesting this was a very turbulent time. The events that occur in this arc are very murky, but I was able to discern 9 people that I could confidently rank. We may not know exactly how strong they were during this time, but I will rank them based off of what we know. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not ranking any characters that are dead by the beginning of this era. This will include Madara because even though he's still young during this war, he is not part of the known shinobi world, so it doesn't feel right to rank him. Before I start with number 9, I'm going to establish who I think were the Kage by the end of this era, because it's not directly stated. We know for sure Hiruzen was a Kage during this war, and that the Sand had not reached the 4th Kazekage yet. Onoki and the 3rd Raikage were likely in power by the end of this war, with who was Kazekage being a mystery. When Kabuto summons Mu, Gengetsu, A, and Raza in the war arc, we learn a little bit about how old they all are. Gengetsu notes that he recognizes Mu and A, but fails to recognize Raza. When Gengetsu talked to Onoki during the war arc, he constantly referred to him as being a brat or little Onoki. This suggests that Onoki was still a teenager or a very young man when Gengetsu and Mu killed each other, since usually any teenager or young man in this series is just referred to as a brat. Because Gengetsu recognized A, he likely became Raikage during this war, or at least was prominent enough for Gengetsu to label him an adversary. Most likely every village's first 2 Kages were dead by the end of this war. Starting with number 9, I have the 3rd Raikage. The reason he's last is that he may not have even reached Kage in this war, and he would have been very young regardless. Because of the severe lack of information on him and his age, I've decided to put him last. Next to number 8 I have Danzo, and at number 7 I have Hiruzen. Hiruzen could be much higher, but this is also the result of there being a lack of information. He also still appears to be a teenager during this time too, so I think he's still a ways off from his prime at this point. Danzo is also worth noting because he is shown to be a rival to Hiruzen, albeit not the most competitive of one. Of course, there were other people on that mission as well, like the village elders and Uchiha and Akumichi, but we don't know anything about them. You could pick any of them as your number 10 if you'd like. Next to number 6 and 5, I have the Gold and Silver brothers individually. Yes, one was defeated by Darui in the war arc, and the other was defeated by Team Asuma, but that is really just the result of the wacky power scaling in the first day of the war arc. I've talked about this many times, but go watch part 3 of my original power ranking series if you want to see me explain why those feats should be ignored, because of how they break the continuity in power scaling. Ignoring that, these brothers are very deserving of their spot on this list. When Kakuzu went into his version 2 state in the war arc, he decimated an entire division of the Shinobi Alliance that they had to be reinforced by an entire other division. Their tracking unit was also able to kill Tobirama, although it is unknown exactly how fatigued Tobirama was at this time. Still, these two are relics of the Warring States period during the First Great Shinobi War. For starters, they possess 4 out of 5 of Hagoromo's treasured ninja tools. They were also speculated by the 4th Raikage to be descendants of Hagoromo due to the fact that they were able to ingest Nine-Tails chakra and still live. They were also pretty barbaric during a time when the world was trying to find a balance for peace. When Tobirama met the 2nd Raikage for a peace summit in the First Shinobi War, they both nearly killed Tobirama in an ambush. They even tried to capture the Nine-Tails at one point, but this was before their First Great Shinobi War, as we know Mito Uzumaki contained the Nine-Tails before Hashirama's death. I decided not to include them in that list because we don't know how prevalent they were in the world before that. These two are still very overlooked by the community considering how influential they were. They killed Tobirama, and their tracking unit was apparently so strong that Tobirama didn't think a team of Hiruzen, Danzo, and other prominent Leaf Ninja could take them on. While their fate is not known, there's no mention of them past this war, so this is the last time I'm going to rank them. Next up, I have Onoki at 4th, and at a tie at 2nd, I have Mu and Gengetsu. The reason the Gold and Silver brothers are below them is that these 3 are fully capable of taking down armies too. Mu himself said that Particle Saga could take down the army in the Lightning Desert, and Gengetsu was the one who killed Mu. This army also immensely struggled against Gengetsu despite having both Gara and Onoki on their side. The reason I put Onoki below these two is because I still believe he's pretty young at this time, considering that Gengetsu died still calling him a brat. I will note that he's actually 7 years older than Hiruzen, so that explains why Hiruzen is so much lower than him in this era. Not too much to say about these three because it's pretty clear that where they stand. The bottom three are too young and unproven in this era to be above them, and the Gold and Silver brothers were less impressive in the war arc than these three as well. Of course, at number 1, I have to put Tobirama, even though he died in this war. It should be noted that at the time of his death, it did appear that his team had been fighting earlier in the day, and the lighting conditions in this scene would suggest that it was getting close to sundown at this point. I think almost everyone in the community views Tobirama as at least one tier above Gengetsu and Mu, and Onoki anyway, so I'm not going to dwell on this ranking since everyone should be on the same page for it. With the rankings now being done, I'll go ahead and recap what happened during this era. Following the death of Hashirama and the distribution of the Bijou, a worldwide level playing field was created for the first time in Shinobi history. Of course, war was the result of this. This war seemed to be a lot messier than any of the other wars, considering that every village was on their third Kage by the end of it. It seems like Kages engaging in wars became more rare as time went on, so this might be the result of undeveloped military tactics. We also see odd things like Tobirama leading a team of 7 instead of the standard 4, alongside with the Gold and Silver brothers leading a team of 20. Konoha hadn't normalized medics as a staple of teams by this point either. This era definitely seems transitory between the Second Great Shinobi War and the Warring States period. You still have relics of uncivilized times like the Gold and Silver brothers running around causing havoc, but then you also have people like the Third Raikage, Onoki, and Hiruzen rise to power and stay in power for at least 2 more wars. More than likely, the end of small-scale conflicts allowed for the end of child soldiers, which would explain why we see so many prodigies in this era. Not as much is known about this time as the Warring States period, so I can't read between the lines too much for this era. As for titles, Tobirama likely kept his title as the fastest shinobi until A replaced him in death. Gengetsu would have had the best Genjutsu with his Clan Mirage, and Mu would have had the best sensory abilities. Mu himself was undetectable by any sensor in the war arc. Danzo would likely be the strongest wind style user, and A would likely be the strongest lightning style user. By the end of the war, most likely Onoki was the strongest in the world as Hiruzen was still a teenager when named Hokage. The results of this war is not really stated, so we don't know who is the strongest village by the end of it. I couldn't find a source on how much time passes before the Second Great Shinobi War starts, but the wiki states 20 years. Now with the Second Great Ninja War, we finally get to a point where we know more than 10 notable characters alive during this era. I will admit I personally think there's a lot of gray area between this war and the next one when it comes to notable events. Like how it's not clear which war Sakumo killed himself in, or if Yager was the Mizukage starting it in the second or third war. Judging by Yager's youthful appearance, I won't rank him for this era though. There aren't any special rules for this era, so I'll get right into the ranking. At number 10 I have Tsunade's lover Dan. He was only a jonin during this time, but he did have aspirations to become Hokage one day. Kabuto went to the trouble of reanimating him, and he was actually the only reanimation on the beachfront that was not sealed. The Shinobi Alliance had to resort to putting a barrier around him, which suggests that he should be stronger than the other Edo Jonin that were there, like Hizashi Hyuga or Asuma. The only jutsu we know he can use is the Spear Transformation Technique, which is an S-rank jutsu. It was even able to travel across the world to Tsunade's body to save her from Madara only moments after Kabuto released Edo Tensei. This could have been the result of him being released from his Edo Tensei body, though. Next to number 9 I have Lady Chiyo. The reason I have her over Dan is that she seemed to be more prominent in her village, and she's more proven in battle. She was the one who sealed Shukaku into Gaara, and she was the one shinobi from the Sand Village chosen to go help Team 7 save Gaara after the Akatsuki captured him. I've always viewed her as the Kakashi of her village, basically meaning she was the top jonin of her village for multiple eras. She was, however, self-admittedly bested by Tsunade in this war due to Tsunade crafting antidotes for all her poisons, and she never was able to get revenge on Sakumo for killing Sasori's parents. So I can't rank her any higher because everyone else is either in the Kage tier or is bordering on it. Next at number 8 I have Danzo. Danzo's fallen a ways away from Hiruzen, and I've decided to let the third Raikage surpass him by this war. In the first war I estimated that A was really young during that time, so I assumed he was much weaker. For this war, I'm going to assume A is in his prime by this point, but Danzo certainly was not at his strongest. He didn't have Izanagi at this point, which was the only thing that kept him in his fight against Sasuke. So I've got Danzo at least one tier lower because I think having 10 Izanagis is a sizable power-up. I still put him on the Kage level tier though, as he did function as the Shadow Kage during this time period. I still have him over Sakamo and Chiyo because we know that they were Jonin while Danzo was an eventual Kage. He also was selected as Kage without the knowledge that he could use Izanagi, so he's likely Kage level in his younger days as well. Next at number 7 I have the Sannin tied. I decided to tie them because there's nothing that separates them in this war and it allowed for more people to be ranked. I put them ahead of people like Danzo and Chiyo because their reputation is even greater than theirs. All of them were considered for Kage at some point, and the Sannin title instilled fear into most of their opponents. When Kisame saw the prospect of fighting against Jiraiya in Part 1, he was not sure if Jiraiya could be beaten based off of his title alone. While they did become probably the most respected non-Kage shinobi in the world for several eras, they were likely far weaker than they were in the modern eras. The only time we see them fight in this era, they're losing heavily to Hanzo of the Salamander, who's basically like a pseudo-Kage. We also know that all of the Sannin did not have some of their key jutsus in their arsenal during this war. Orochimaru didn't have Edo Tensei, Tsunade was not able to regenerate through fatal wounds, and Jiraiya did not have the Rasengan either. What they did all likely have was their summonings at least, because their summons did recognize each other in the modern era. If I had to break these guys up into rankings, I would put Tsunade ahead of Jiraiya and Orochimaru. It was noted that she was responsible for the idea of including medics on teams becoming a commonplace, all the way up to the modern era. While you may be surprised by some of the people above them, it really does seem like the Sannin were way weaker than they were when they were younger, based off of the information I presented. Next at number 6 I have the White Fang Sakamo Take. The reason I put him above the Sannin is that it was stated by Minato that the Sannin did not compare to him during his time, but because we know literally nothing else about him power-wise, this is the highest I can place him. He does get mentioned by some people in the modern eras, and he was strong enough to have his own nickname as well, but we don't know what he did to become so famous. He's the highest shinobi on here that wasn't a leader during this era. Just remember the Sannin were way weaker during this time period, so that statement isn't as impressive as everyone makes it out to be. Next, at number 5, I have Hanzo. He's right here because he beat the Sannin, but like I said, this is not as impressive as you may think. The circumstances of their fight are also not known, so it may be possible that the Sannin had been fighting before Hanzo entered the battle, similar to Tobirama before the Gold and Silver brothers killed him. The problem with Hanzo is that this is his only feat, so it's hard to rank him. In the war, he loses to Mifune, but that was also said to be because he had lost his conviction and thus lost his will to fight. So I've decided to place him as the lowest of all the leaders in this war, mainly because we know very little about how strong he was during his prime. Next, number 4, I have the third Kazekage. He likely was in this war because we know for a fact Sasori killed him in the Third Great Shinobi War. For him to have been built up as the reputation of the strongest Kazekage ever, I think he would have needed at least one full war to do that. Like Hanzo, we also know very little about how strong he really was. I've decided to place him towards the bottom for leaders in this era. I've put him above Hanzo because he does lead a bigger village and does have a far stronger reputation. Sasori really championed how powerful the Iron Sand was, so this really feels like a case of a goat of a small village versus a goat of one of the 5 great nations. I give the edge to the third Kazekage because of that. Next, number 3, I have the third Raikage. He also seems to be revered as the goat of his village, but he has more feats to back it up. The Kazekage frequently had to subdue the One-Tails, but for A, he frequently had to subdue the A-Tails, who was much stronger. We also see when A was reanimated in the Warwick that the only way for him to be defeated was through using his own attack against him. Even KCM-1 Naruto's Rasen Shuriken didn't damage him enough to be sealed away. It took Naruto directing his own attack into his chest to actually break through his lightning armor. This was not the first time an army failed to damage him either. When he died fighting against 10,000 shinobi, it was noted that he died from exhaustion instead of a fatal blow. This was during the Third Great Shinobi War too, so this isn't the last time we'll see him on the list. Next, at number 2, I have Onoki, and at number 1, I have Hiruzen. I have Hiruzen surpassing Onoki in this war because Onoki's age advantage is not as prominent by this era. In the first war, Hiruzen was a teenager, whereas Onoki was likely a young man, but in this war they should both be adults now. Most people would agree with Hiruzen being 1, but I will mention that Kabuto said Hiruzen was still the strongest of the 5 Kage at his death. I give Onoki the title of 2 because he also separates himself from the other Kage. During their fight against Madara, he takes a leadership position and even saves the other Kage's lives when Madara almost killed them with the Deep Forest Bloom Jutsu. He also was the one who took out all of Madara's full-body Susanoo clones too. Also, when Mu saw the Shinobi Alliance in the war, he said that only Onoki was the one that could stop him from vaporizing the entire army. For time reasons, I won't go any further into this Third Raikage and Onoki discussion. That's the ranking for this era, so here's a recap of everything that happened. Likely a generation had passed since the First Great Shinobi War, and it really shows in this era. War tactics seem to have evolved greatly since the last war. Bulky armors seem to have disappeared, and the Jonin jackets look far more modern. And we also see the rise of medical ninja in this war too. With the world now being far more globalized than the Warring States period, many shinobi were able to make names for themselves on an international level. People like the White Fang, the Sannin, and Hanzo of the Salamander seem to be key fighters in this war. The details of the conclusion of this war were never made clear, but we do know that the Rain Village never fully recovered from it. Even in the modern era, the Rain Village looked to be in a state of disrepair, along with looking far less populated than any of the other villages we see in the modern era. As for titles, the Third Raikage likely has the title for fastest shinobi, but his lightning armor could also have a claim for being the strongest defense. The third Kazekage contends for that title with his Iron Sand, which was also derived from the One Tails. A likely still has one of the strongest lightning style, and Danzo likely has the strongest wind style. The third Kazekage emerges as the strong Earth style user, since Magnet releases a variant of Earth style. Hiruzen likely had the strongest fire style, but abilities like Genjutsu and Dojutsu seem to be unclaimed for this era. I could possibly go on, but I'll stop there when it comes to titles. This war seemed to be less bloodier than the last one, considering that all the Kage, to our knowledge, survived it. This suggests Kage's fighting in wars became much rarer than the last era. There were also less notable deaths across the board, with only Dan being the confirmed death. Sakumo probably died before the Third Great Shinobi War, but that was self-inflicted anyway. 8 out of 10 of the shinobi will be eligible to be ranked in the next era, but not all of them will make it due to how many new shinobi emerged in that era. In the Third Great Shinobi War, we hear about many prominent names during this era, but this may be because of how recent it was. With the previous eras, a logical in-universe explanation for the lack of big names was that the power levels were weaker on average, but this era may have actually been weaker than the last. We know for a fact that the beginning of the war was caused by the great nations not being able to protect their borders due to weakening. By the end of it, Konoha was forced to use child soldiers, so the average power levels must have plummeted since the time of the Second Great Ninja War. Due to how many people we know were active during this war, I'm going to have several honorable mentions and several people I exclude for the sake of the video. Starting with the exclusions, I've decided to exclude both Obito and Nagato. Like with Madara in the First Great Ninja War, Obito was not part of the known shinobi world after awakening his Mangekyo Sharingan. So while yes, he did interfere with the Leaf in the Mist after the war, it feels wrong ranking him since this video is about who's the strongest in the known shinobi world in each era. I won't officially rank him, but just know if I did, I'd put him right under Minato. Nagato also is getting excluded due to us not knowing how powerful he was while he was active in the war. We know the Akatsuki were an organization promoting peace, but Nagato seemed to be unknown by even Hanzo at this time, since Hanzo did not acknowledge him until Nagato started rampaging after Yahiko died. So he must have not been that prominent during that time, and after that incident Nagato was dead to the world just like Obito was. Even the master spy Jiraiya was under the belief that all 3 of his students died during this war. I suspect that Nagato did not have full control over the Rinnegan before this incident, as we do know that when he was a child, the Rinnegan only activated during life or death situations. So due to these factors, I'm not going to rank Nagato because by the time he was powerful, he was dead to the known shinobi world just like Obito. Those are the only 2 I'm excluding, so here are the honorable mentions that did not make the cut. Kakashi rose to international prominence during this war, but the top 10 is stacked with Kage, so I didn't include him. Sasori also got the nickname of Sasori of the Red Sand during this war, but how strong he was exactly is unknown. He did, however, kill the third Kazekage, but we don't know if this was the result of a proper fight or if Sasori somehow stealthily killed him with poison. Whether Sasori got the third Kazekage puppet during this war is also unclear. The Sand Village elders say that he disappeared during a time of war, but Chiyo says this happened over 10 years ago when Gaara was captured. The Third Great Shinobi War was closer to 20 years before the events of Part 2, so those are 2 conflicting statements there. Either way, no one knew that Sasori had this power anyway. The only other feat possibly suggesting that he was Kage level during this war was him saying that he destroyed a small nation with his 100 puppets jutsu, but this was likely after this era. He used his core to use those puppets, and we know that Sasori was not a puppet until after leaving the village. There's a lot of gray area with Sasori during this time period, so I think it's better just to mention him than to rank him. I'll also take this moment to mention Kakuzu since he's been alive in every era so far. I've also decided not to rank him because of him not really being a part of the known Shinobi War until the Akatsuki mobilized. While he does say he fought the first Hokage and imply that he saw Gengoku die, there's no information on him in any of these eras. We don't even know when he went rogue. Again, the focus of this video is more on who is the strongest in the known Shinobi world, and I don't think Kakuzu was that prominent until his time in the Akatsuki. The last honorable mention I'll make is Hanzo. Again, I have to lowball him because he did beat up on the young Sannin, and was only the leader of a small nation. This also was likely the war where he began to regress, since he became paranoid that the Akatsuki were going to take over the Rain Village when that was far from the truth. There also was no stories of him doing anything notable during this era anyway. Starting at number 10, I have the 4th Kazekage, Raza. Again, while it's not crystal clear when the 3rd Kazekage disappeared, I'm still going to include this in this era. Because of that gray area, I've decided to extend this era to include some of the events that were likely after the 3rd Great Shinobi War. This is because these events are closer to the 3rd Great Shinobi War than the modern eras. Anyways, Raza is a bit overlooked in terms of power. He regularly defeated the One-Tails, and his Gold Sand was stronger than Gaara's during the war arc. He was quickly defeated by Gaara, but the way this played out makes it seem like he was another Edo Tensei character that just had to be written out immediately. Being the leader of a great nation is enough to get him to 10 though. Next to number 9 I have Yagura. He likely was not empowered during the war as he did not become the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails until after Rin died as his Jinchuriki. He fits into this era more than the modern ones though. The main reason I have him above Raza is that he can control the Three Tails, whereas we know Raza could subdue the One Tails. Yagura also looked more impressive during the war arc too. His Coral Palm was strong enough to immobilize KCM-1 Naruto after all. There are some other abilities that could suggest him being higher, but this is one of those characters where we know very little about, so I just have to lowball him. Next to number 8 I have the 3rd Kazekage. He's really only here due to reputation, and he seems to have a much stronger one than Raza. I will note that if Sasori defeated him in battle, then Sasori would have been at least one spot ahead of him. Next to number 7 I have Killer B. We know he was a perfect Jinchuriki by this war, and he was strong enough to be a tag team with the 4th Raikage. The only two things we see him do are save A from being stabbed by Minato, and we see B react to Minato trying to teleport and stab him from behind. I've decided to lowball him because he appears pretty young in this war. We also know B had been training since this war, since he was training right before Taka tried to capture him. Even if B was in his prime, everyone above him are commonly argued to be stronger than him, so I'm going to lowball him for this era just because of his youth. I'll put him above Yagura and the Kazekages though because he has the stronger tailed beast feats, and he has better feats once he reaches his prime too. Next to number 6 I have the 4th Raikage, A. He started this war as a Jonin, but he was a clear-cut choice for the successor of the 3rd Raikage. Again, not much is known about him in this war other than his interactions with Minato. I am also choosing to lowball him because of his youth, just like I did with B. I'll give him the nod over B though, as he's clearly the leader of the AB combo, and he has a considerable age advantage on B too in this era. Also again, even in his prime, many people would argue that people ahead of him are stronger than him, so I have no problem lowballing these two because of their ages. Next to number 5 I have the Sannin. The Sannin seem to not do anything notable in this war compared to the last one, but I have decided to rank them closer to their modern era counterparts. It seems like a generation had passed between the 2nd and 3rd Great Wars, so I can't really use the youth card on these three anymore. We also know Jiraiya probably learned the Rasengan in this war, and Orochimaru was a candidate for the 4th Hokage as well. So while usually people like B and A are compared to the Sannin, I will give the Sannin the edge for this era due to them being much older. I don't have anything else to say about them specifically because there's a severe lack of information on them for this era. Next to number 4 I have the 3rd Raikage. The 3rd Raikage is usually compared to the Sannin of the modern era, so I give him the edge in this era because he died in this war. Like I said, the Sannin didn't have things like Edo Tensei or Maitota regeneration until the modern era. He also has the way better feat of dying from exhaustion, fighting 10,000 Shinobi, compared to the Sannin having no battle feats during this war. I think most people would agree he deserves to be above everyone below him, but the next few spots are contentious. Next to number 3 I have Onoki. Again, this comes down to Onoki looking so much stronger than the other Kage during the war arc. I don't have time to deep dive into this for this video, but if you really think about it, Onuki had a better showing in the war than A did in my opinion. Again, that's why he's over all these other Kage in this era as well. He outperformed people like Tsunade in the 4th Raikage despite him being an old man in the war arc. Next to number 2 I have Hiruzen. Like I said in the last era, he was hated to be the strongest Kage at his death by Kabuto. Hiruzen's far more popular of a character than Onuki, so I won't waste time trying to convince you why he places higher. Last to number 1 I have Minato. He seemed to be the savior of the Leaf during this era based on the respect he commanded. He's the only person on this list to have had a flee on sight order for this war, for example. The only person here that the community might contend with is Prime Hiruzen, supposedly being stronger than Minato. I think that trend has seemingly died out by now, but I will say this. During the Ninetales attack, everyone fighting the Ninetales said to stall in order for Minato to come, including Hiruzen himself. It was Minato who ultimately subdued both Obito and the Ninetales separately, not Hiruzen. Minato's reputation is also far better than Hiruzen by the time of the modern era. When it becomes apparent Orochimaru was planning on attacking the Leaf Village, Anko told Hiruzen to his face that she wished Minato was still alive to fight him. Hiruzen's own student Jiraiya even told Naruto that no one could compare to Minato shortly after Hiruzen died. There are more examples of this, but I'll end this by saying if you want to know more about what I think about the idea of Prime Hiruzen, I'll link a video that I have on it in the description. But now with the rankings done, I'll go ahead and recap what happened in this era. For whatever reason, it seems the 5 great nations weakened in power since the 2nd Great Shinobi War, leading to the start of the 3rd Great Shinobi War. It seems that the Leaf was fighting the Stone, Mist, and Lightning in this war, with possibly the Rain and Sand Village as their only allies. We know Hanzo teamed up with Danzo to destroy the Akatsuki, but the Sand's role in this war is not clear. More than likely they were allies with the Leaf, since we know that they were allies in the modern era. Due to the Leaf being outnumbered, they did eventually have to resort to using child soldiers, which no other nation reportedly did. On average, the Leaf probably fell behind the other great nations during this era, but with Minato on their side, the Leaf seemed to pull off a win in the end. The Sand also was likely weaker than the other great nations by the end of the war. We know that the Sand attacked the Leaf in the modern era because of the Wen daimyo outsourcing work to the Leaf Village. It was also a failed invasion attempt despite them having the help of Sound Village. Even though this occurred during the modern era, this likely started towards the end of this era because we know that the Sand was stressed about stability when Gaara was first made Jinchuriki. As for the other villages, we aren't sure about their strengths during this era. Bottom line is that the Leaf's average power severely declined due to being outnumbered in this war, but Minato made up for that and let the Leaf exit this war with a win. As for the titles of this era, many of them have stayed in the same place as the last one. The Raikages have the strongest lightning style and a claim for the strongest defense. The Kazekages have the strongest earth style variant and have a claim for the strongest defense. Danzo should still have the strongest wind style too. Minato emerges as the fastest shinobi, who also has the strongest sealing jutsus. You could argue he also has the strongest defense in flying Raijin, although that is more so seen as an offensive ability. The strongest genjutsu and dojutsu could possibly go to Fugaku, since he was the leader of the Uchiha at this time. I'm not including Shisui for this era because we have no confirmation that he participated in the Third Great War. Bottom line for this era is that the great nations greatly weakened from the last era. That was why this war was started, and by the end of it, Konoha was forced to use child soldiers, which was the first time this happened since the Warring States period. The reasons why we see so many prominent names in this era compared to the last one can just be explained by recency, really. That's the end of all the eras preceding the ones the series progressed through, so now I can split up the modern era into different eras. For the next era, I'm just going to call it Part 1 because there's no particular event that defines this era like the previous wars did. The most notable events would be the Uchiha Massacre, Konoha Crush, and the assassination of the Hokage and the Kazekage. Like I talked about in the last era, I'm not going to consider things like Minato's death, Yagura's death, or the third Kazekage's death because those seem closer to the Third Great Ninja War rather than the events of Part 1. I will, however, include the Uchiha Massacre because that was 5 years beforehand. This time around, I'm going to have to exclude even more characters because they're not known on an international level, if at all. This includes most of the Akatsuki except for Kisame and Itachi, because Kakashi did say they were both highly wanted criminals. People like Pain and Obito are simply unknown at this time, and people like Deidara and Tsusuri don't seem prominent until the Akatsuki mobilizes. The spirit of this video is still the strongest in the known shinobi world, so to keep the topic more interesting, I'm going to keep it that way. There are only 2 honorable mentions for this era. Kakashi is the first one. Even though he's not Kage level in Part 1, he gets the recognition of one, so I feel the need to mention him honorably. The other one would be Mei. The person at 10 is a tad bit more proven than her, because really her only impressive feat would be her title as Kage. Starting at number 10, I have Raza. He likely was backstabbed by Orochimaru as his corpse was found with his Kage robes on. Despite some people dying and others emerging, he was still able to keep that 10 spot. Next to number 9, I have Shisui. Shisui is always a taboo topic because based off what we know in the manga, we know very little about him. But there's enough information for me to lowball him here. We see Ao at the Kage summit immediately recognize Shisui's chakra signature in Danzo's eye, despite not having fought him in over a decade. He highly praised Shisui as a fighter and explained how his genjutsu was not counterable unless some other person intervened for you. Obito is adamant to take Shisui's eye from Danzo at the Kage summit, and Kabuto also showed interest in reanimating him to Obito in the war arc. There's some debate over how exactly Shisui's genjutsu worked, but it has been theorized that his eyes had two separate genjutsus. The one Danzo had could only do small ones, but the one that Itachi had was said to only be able to be used every 10 years. I'm not going to dive into a rabbit hole in this video, but it seems that Shisui could use genjutsu frequently enough that Ao was able to know a lot about it. Bottom line is that Shisui had two Mangekos, so he probably could use a Susanoo if he had already figured out his genjutsu Mangekyo abilities. Because of him having a Susanoo, I feel comfortable lowballing him at 9. Next to number 8 and 7, I have B in the 4th Raikage. Nothing notable happens for them in this era other than B being confined to his ravine. Next to number 6, I have Tsunade and Jiraiya tied. This tie is more so to make the list bigger, but it is also fair because the Sannin are equally respected in this series. There's never a moment where anyone ever suggests that one Sannin is stronger than the other, which is not the case for the other titles such as Hokage. Orochimaru definitely separated himself from the other Sannin in this era though, but I'll say that for when I get to him. Even though people like A and B are often compared to the Sannin, I've decided to give the Sannin the edge in this video because they have a much better international reputation. Again, this video is very focused on public perception. Next to number 5, I have Kisame, who I think is a tier above everyone below him on this list. If you look at his fight against B, it should become apparent why. While he did say in part 1 that he wasn't sure if Itachi himself could ever take on one of the legendary three, most people seem to know this would not be the case, especially since Orochimaru admitted Itachi was stronger than him later in that arc. So I would say this is more of a case of Kisame respecting Jiraiya's title. Ultimately, B is someone who is often compared to Sannin just like A is, and we see B get destroyed by Kisame. Matchup aside, I think that still shows, along with some other feats that Kisame has, that he's a tier above the Sannin. Next to number 4, I have Onoki. I'm giving Hiruzen the edge again because this is the era we actually hear Hiruzen was the strongest of the 5 Kage. As for Kisame, I don't have the time to fully explain him being lower. Onoki's certainly more respected internationally, but in terms of one-on-one, I don't think Kisame has an answer for particle style or Onoki's flight. Next to number 3, I have Hiruzen, and at number 2, I have Orochimaru. This is not going to be Orochimaru at the end of the era, but instead his peak. At his peak, he could summon 2 Kage-level Shinobi with infinite regeneration. His fight with Hiruzen ended with Hiruzen dying and Orochimaru being permanently weakened, so it's still technically a win for Orochimaru. Some have tried to claim that Hiruzen was emotionally held back in this fight, but I don't view it that way. In the anime, Hiruzen was shown to be mentally struggling at points, but in the manga this never happened. In fact, Hiruzen gets mental amps along the way due to his will of fire. Orochimaru, on the other hand, was crying before the fight, and never fought alongside his reanimations despite that being the best play for him. All in all, Orochimaru won after using his forbidden jutsu, so I say he surpassed Hiruzen in that brief time frame. Last at number 1, I have Itachi, who is said by Orochimaru to be stronger than him. Even ignoring that, I think the community would agree on a healthy Itachi being stronger than old Hiruzen. With all the rankings out of the way, let's recap what happened during this era. Although this was a relatively quiet era, all the great nations likely weakened during this time. The Sand felt the need to attack the Leaf because the Leaf was imposing on their economy, and the Leaf had several critical losses during this time. Orochimaru went rogue, Itachi killed the strongest clan of the Leaf and then went rogue, a prodigy in Sasuke went rogue, Kakashi admits to himself he had gotten rusty and out of shape before Konoha Crush, Hiruzen was assassinated, and the Leaf lost half their manpower after Konoha Crush. It's probably the weakest era for the Leaf overall, which is a trend that started before the Third Great Ninja War. The other great nations were also likely weakening at this time. 3 years later, Onuki admits to having to use the Akatsuki at the Kage Summit, and he also accuses the 4th Raikage of constantly trying to acquire new jutsus and power in general. As for the titles held in this era, there are a few shakeups. Danzo still holds the Wind title, and the Kazekage still holds the Earth title. The Raikage still holds the Lightning title, and claims the title of fastest in the world after Minato's death. The Raikage and Kazekage still contend over the title of best known defense, since it's unlikely that many would know about Susanoo based off of reactions at the Kage Summit. Kisame emerges as the strongest water style user, and this is the first time someone has claimed that title since the first Great Shinobi War. Itachi and Shisui contend for the strongest Genjutsu title, which has also not been seen since that war. This was a mostly peaceful era on the international level, but most nations seemed to weaken during this time. The next era would soon turn into utter chaos though, completely flipping the top 10 on its head. The mobilization of the Akatsuki put the entire world into a state of panic and chaos. Based off of how all the Kage were talking to each other initially at the Kage Summit, along with the upset balance of Tailed Beast, war looked imminent. Ironically, the threat of Madara created a common enemy for the 5 great nations to unite against, instead of going to war with each other. For this video, I will say that this era spans from the moment Deidara and Sasori first infiltrated the Sand Village, up until the end of the Kage Summit. By that point, the traditional Akatsuki was hanging on by a thread, and the allied Shinobi's forces was a landmark moment in Shinobi history. I don't have any exclusions for this era, so I'll jump to the honorable mentions. Sasori could arguably be on this list, but because of his lack of international recognition, I didn't include him. He seems to be revered in the Sand Village, particularly among puppet masters, but no other villages seem to talk about him at all. While he did make a name for himself in the Third Great Shinobi War, he has been underground ever since. Danzo is also worth mentioning for this era, and he doesn't make the list for the same reason. He was so underground that only A at the summit seemed to bring up his shadiness, despite Danzo having been active for 5 eras now. Again, in a normal ranking video, these two could have made the top 10, but I want to keep the spirit of the video by giving reputations as the edge in every tier. Starting at number 10, I have Deidara. By his death, he had made quite a name for himself at a young age. He was already infamous in the Stone, judging by how Onoki and his guards reacted to him, and he became infamous in the Leaf and Sand for assassinating Gaara. For this ranking, I'll bring up some feats, since I can see Deidara being this high raising some eyebrows. He's one of the higher people on this list when it comes to pure attack power. His C3 threatened to destroy the entire Sand Village, similar to how Pain destroyed the entire Leaf Village with one almighty push. His C4 is only counterable by people who can run electricity through their body, and the only people that can do this on this list are A and Sasuke. Even one blast of his C1 was enough to defeat Gaara, and his C2 was able to seriously injure Sasuke in his version 2 curse mark state. His feats are enough to put him in the conversation in this era, and his infamy among the 3 different villages gives him the edge over the honorable mentions. Next, number 9 through 5, we have a near repeat from the last list. It goes B, A, Sannin, Kisame, and ends with Onoki. The difference this time is that I have dropped Orochimaru back to normal Sannin level since he lost his ability to perform Edo Tensei. Again, I have decided just to group the Sannin in this video to make the list more interesting, and their rankings are highly contested in the community anyway. Kisame and Onoki are still a tier above the 3 below them for the same reasons as the last era. I've put Deidara last for that tier, as I don't think his reputation is as high as the ones above him. Most put Deidara below them anyway. Next at a tie for number 4, I have Sasuke and Naruto. While their level of reputation does differ, I decided to tie them since this is highly contested by the community and to allow more people on the list. Naruto was revered among the Leaf Village after defeating Pain in front of everybody, but outside of that he has virtually no reputation. He does gain a little bit of a reputation from the Sand and the Akatsuki in this era though. Sasuke is a bit more international. He seemed to be important enough that Danzo felt the need to send Sai to assassinate him. Chojuro refers to Sasuke as the man who killed Zabuza at the Kage Summit. A called a Kage Summit because he thought B was assassinated by Sasuke, and then Sasuke proceeded to terrorize the summit. So while the other great nations left without knowing Naruto's name, everyone certainly knew Sasuke's name and power by the end of it. Because I view these two as near equals, I'll tie them though. Next, number 3, I have Itachi, who I view as a tier above these characters. Even in the war arc, when Sasuke first got the Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, I would say that Itachi outperformed him in that Kabuto fight. Same for Naruto against Nagato, when Itachi basically had to save Naruto twice in that fight. He also has the reputation to go along with it, as the Leaf did frame him as the person who killed the strongest clan in the world. Next, number 2, I have Pain. Pain surprisingly doesn't gain much of a reputation for himself after cratering the Leaf Village. village. He's kind of an afterthought at the Kage Summit. I'm more so putting him here because I do think that Pain is stronger than sick Itachi, and Itachi was likely somewhat sick for all of part 2. Not much else to say about him, as I think everyone knows where Pain stands. Just remember that Pain had Naruto pinned down and totally vulnerable to any attack before Naruto just started to rampage. Last at number 1, I have Obito. Obito versus Pain is its own discussion, one where I favor Obito because I don't think Pain has any path to victory against him. Aside from that, Obito's reputation as Madara Uchiha scared the 5 Kage so badly they immediately teamed up with no questions asked. The top 3 were pretty cut and dry, so I'll move on to the recap. While this era only spanned about a year, this was probably the most tumultuous time in Shinobi history outside of the Great Wars. Several Jinchuriki and Seven-Tailed Beasts died during this time period, almost leading to a 4th Great Shinobi War among the great nations. We also saw several other people quickly rise to prominence in this era, such as Deidara, Sasuke, Naruto, Pain, and Obito. Due to 3 of the great nations losing their tailed beast, I would say that at the end of this era, this was the weakest point in Shinobi history since probably the First Great Shinobi War. While the top 10 is looking the strongest it has since the First Great Shinobi War, the loss of the tailed beast is basically the same as the loss of a nuclear weapon. On to the titles though. Danzo still holds the wind title, as Naruto only knows one wind-style jutsu. Kisame still holds the water title, and the Raikage still holds the speed title. Sasori takes over the earth title with his iron sand, and Sasuke takes over the lightning style, as his lightning style is way more diversified and powerful than the Raikage's. Itachi and Obito now contend for the strongest genjutsu, and Obito definitely holds the strongest defense in comboing now. Pain's Rinnegan takes the strongest dojutsu title. This was a chaotic era that ended in unity, but the 4th Great Shinobi War certainly shook up the world, considering that the Allied Shinobi Alliance lost half of its forces by the end of the first day alone. I've decided to skip over the war arc for this video because it's not much of an era at all. The entire war was over within a few days, and the most prominent characters don't even feel like Shinobi. 6 Pass is a tier well above a god of Shinobi, so ranking people like Kage and Jubito just doesn't fit the spirit of the video. If you want to see my war arc rankings, I would suggest watching part 3 of my original power ranking series. I'd rather focus on the epilogue of Naruto, but ignoring what happens in Boruto. So basically, this era will start at the end of the war and not have a definite end. The end is really just the hypothetical happy ending we saw at the end of Naruto instead of what we got in Boruto. Of course, the time would be devoid of conflict, but the reputations that were built in the war arc is still worth talking about. I actually didn't have any exceptions or honorable mentions for this era because I would say no one below number 10 is on the same tier as them. Starting at number 10 I have B, and at number 9 I have A. These two have made the list for 4 straight eras now, but they have slid down to the end due to the fact that their contributions in the war arc were less impactful than those ahead of them. Also, A presumably would retire just like he did in Boruto, so he would become less notable during this time. Next to number 8 I have Gaara, who definitely made a bigger name for himself in the war arc. He was the lead commander of the Shinobi forces, and his efforts were seen by more than A and B. A was only really noted to have fought Madara, and B was most active against Obito before the allied Shinobi forces showed up. So they didn't have that much of an audience. Meanwhile, many in the Shinobi Alliance got to see Gaara fight Mu, Gengetsu, and Madara. He also later helped stop the first meteor that Madara dropped. He also presumably would continue to be Kazekage during this era, so his reputation would not start to fade like it did with A and B. Next to number 7 I have Tsunade. Gaara would arguably be 7, but the honorable title of Sannin has been more directly proven than my speculation on Gaara's reputation post-war. Again, Tsunade gets the edge because of the Sannin status, but there's some people in this tier I would actually think surpass her in reputation in this era. Next to number 6 I have Sakura, and Sakura gets the edge over Tsunade because she has more of an apparent impact in the war. We see Shizune and Hashirama arguably equating her to Tsunade at certain points. The Shinobi Alliance also sees her use her summon alongside Naruto and Sasuke, which prompts some people to say this was like the birth of a new Sannin. She also was active during the fight against Kaguya, which I speculate would do wonders for your reputation since almost everyone else was defeated during that time. Next to number 5 I have Kakashi. He's at the top of this tier for the same reasons as Sakura, but he gets the edge because he becomes Hokage. His reputation was already almost Sannin level, so adding Hokage to his resume finally puts him over the edge for me. Next to number 4 I have Onoki, who I think is a tier above everyone else power-wise. Again, look at how well he did against the Kage reanimations and Madara compared to the other Kage. Many shinobi saw him help defeat Mu and help stop Madara's first meteor, but I doubt this did much for his reputation after being active in every single era of shinobi. He's the only one on this list to accomplish that, by the way. Next, number 3, I have Orochimaru. This may come as a surprise, but just remember he can, at the very least, still summon Tobirama and Hiruzen as reanimations. I don't consider Hashirama because he can't control him, and Minato is debatable because he might be able to break through Edo Tensei if he activates KCM. Even though there's no reason for him to do this in a time of peace, it's still something that's on the table. With Naruto and Sasuke alive during this era, his reanimations aren't relevant compared to them, but with Orochimaru being biologically immortal, he would become very relevant after that. Next, number 2, I have Kabuto. Kabuto is also biologically immortal if he chooses to be, and his Edo Tensei arsenal would be stronger than Orochimaru's. Orochimaru has Tobirama and Hiruzen, but Kabuto could have most of the Akatsuki and many previous Kage as well. He also would have more of a name for himself in the war, since everyone in the Shinobi Alliance had to fight his Edo Tensei. Orochimaru's Edo Tensei didn't show up until the very end, on the other hand. Even excluding Edo Tensei, Kabuto has Sage Mode while Orochimaru presumably does not. That alone puts him ahead of everyone below him. Last to the tie for number 1, I have Naruto and Sasuke. I decided to tie these two to allow for more names to appear on the list. This topic is also highly contested in the community, but in universe, Naruto likely has a much stronger reputation now. His Shadow Clone showed up to every front of the war, while Sasuke didn't show up until the very end. Naruto also became Hokage, while Sasuke started working in the shadows. They're so far ahead of everyone else, though, that it doesn't even really matter. Overall, this era was the most peaceful, hypothetically, but it also could be the weakest on average. Well over half the shinobi died in the 4th Great Shinobi War, and there was no reason to remilitarize afterwards like with the previous wars. Not much else to say about this hypothetical era because there's no future for it. I will mention that Kabuto and Orochimaru could outlive everyone and then become the strongest in the world if they wanted to. On to the titles though. With Danzo now dead and Naruto surpassing him long ago, Naruto takes the win title. He also would take the speed title as Naruto's arsenal is more focused on speed than Sasuke's. Sasuke still has the lightning style, and he has the Dojutsu and Genjutsu title for this era too. They also definitely compete for the best defense title. The only titles these two don't take are the Earth and Water title because they don't use those elements hardly. Those go to Gaara and Mei respectively. To finish the recap, I'll broadly recap what happened in every era power-wise. In the Warring States period, the average shinobi was far weaker than in the modern eras. Fighting was mostly close quarters combat and bulky armor because people were less proficient in ninjutsu on average. This era ended with the first Kage Summit redistributing the Tailed Beast, which ended all the small-scale conflicts we saw in this era. The next era would start and end with the First Great Shinobi War. While gods of shinobi had disappeared by this era, the average shinobi likely grew stronger. Armor became less bulky, warfare became more modern, and the people towards the bottom of the list became stronger than the last era. Likely every village lost at least one Kage during this era though, so by the end of it, many great nations were likely greatly weakened. The Second Great Shinobi War started and ended the next era. While the previous list was mostly Kage, this list has more Jonin on it. This suggests that Kage had stopped fighting in wars as much, and the average shinobi had also gotten more prominent. We also know that Tsunade made medics more commonplace in battle during this war, and this is something we saw leading all the way up to the modern eras. The Third Great Shinobi War started the next era, and its lingering loose ends ended before the events of Part 1. For whatever reason, the great nations weakened during this time, especially the Leaf since it was forced to use child soldiers for the first time since the Warring States period. The bottom of this list was much stronger than the last era, but Minato emerging as the first known demigod was a big change. Without him, the Leaf likely lose this war, so he's quite the phenom internationally. The events of Part 1 was a mostly peaceful time, but it is possible that the great nations had grown even weaker than the start of the Third Great Shinobi War. Onoki had to resort to using the Akatsuki, and aid was said by Onoki at the Kage Summit to constantly be searching for jutsus to strengthen his nation. The Sand also was in such a desperate state that it felt the need to ally with Orochimaru to take down its only ally in the Leaf Village. The Leaf especially was weakened. It lost people like Orochimaru, Itachi, Shisui, the Uchiha clan, and Hiruzen by the end of the era. It also lost half of its forces in Konoha Crush. Part 2 starts with the Akatsuki mobilizing and ends with the Akatsuki basically dissolving while the five great nations team up for the first time ever. While this time period was only about a year, this was one of the most unstable times in shinobi history. The average shinobi was not that affected, but three of the great nations were unfathomably weakened due to the loss of their tailed beast. The Fourth Great Shinobi War produced the most peaceful time in shinobi history, but also possibly the weakest on average. The world suffered massive casualties after this war, but unlike the previous ones, there was no need to build up your army afterwards. Gods and Shinobis did return for the first time since the Warring States period, though. There weren't that many interesting trends I can think of for these lists because they changed so much in every arc, so I'll end this video by just pointing out who was the strongest in the world in every era of Shinobi. There actually was a different person for each era, and this actually kind of shocked me. We went from Hashirama to Tobirama to Hiruzen to Minato to Itachi to Obito, and ended with Naruto and Sasuke. I just wanted to point that out because that surprised me. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Comment something if you have something to say, and thank you all for watching. I guess I'll see y'all next time.